opportunity and a political opportunity. So I really see I see the city as a reflection of humanity, of the best that we can be as humans come together thinking about civic structures. And I really believe that the best human condition exists in a city situation, in a city structure.
And you were involved with selecting the artists and asking them to reflect that theme.
Yes. And some of them, and most of them, in the way that they should have entered into the thematic very differently, sometimes interpersonally, sometimes critically, and that's important to talk about. And I think when we get to Phil can talk about a critical relationship to economy right now, and others more abstractly. Yes, so we have a diverse range of interpretations, of understandings.
Phil, your work, Volatility Smile, is set in a very non-traditional gallery space, the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. Describe the piece and talk about why that's an appropriate space.
Sure. So the piece is, it's 24 flat screen televisions kind of on these little rolling carts, and they go sort of end to end through, they sort of on a diagonal line through the lobby of what used to be the sort of bank teller window lobby of the Federal Reserve Bank, which is now a museum. And on those screens, I did some sort of computer graphics animations, kind of using the same software that you would use to make like Pixar movies. So all kind of 3D modeled things. Some of which are based on the shapes that you would see like in the ceiling patterns of the room itself, right? And so the ceiling of the Fed in that space, if you've been in there, I'm sure most of you guys have, it's beautiful. And it's a kind of a stunning example of sort of classical architecture, very deliberately designed to make the people that kind of pass through that space feel comfortable and to sort of feel at ease, I suppose, because that's a good bank, kind of instills confidence. And, you know, the Federal Reserve in particular is all about a kind of confidence. And so my animations are more about anxiety. And so I thought that was like a really nice tension between the two things. So I kind of use one of the things that computer graphics software is really good at is making things kind of, you know, unstable forms, things that aren't solid and lasting. And so I thought that would be a really appropriate thing to do as a kind of intention with that space.
And how did the Fed's staff react to your invasion of their turf?
Oh, I think it was good. I mean, I think that we really got along. We had a great time doing it, and we actually gave a talk to some of the Fed employees, much like in this kind of context here, and had really interesting discussions with some of the economists because the video has a lot of, economists, especially if you're a behavioral economist, you like things like fear and anxiety because there are things that you think about a lot. And so we had a lot to talk about, even though I don't know a lot about economics. I know a lot about my own anxiety about money. So that was good.
Universal.
Yeah.
Jessica, your home base is New York, but your piece at the Akron Art Museum is a reflection of your Midwest roots in Chicago. Tell us about the After Willis series.
Sure. So the After Willis series is a series of grids that utilize the seat inserts from trains that are operating in Chicago, a part of the Chicago Transit Authority. So over the past several years, I've been collecting seat inserts that are found on the train cars there. And then I install those seat inserts on the wall in different grid configurations that are based off the interior of the train cars. So through a lot of emailing and cold calling to city institutions in Chicago, particularly the CTA, but also IDOT, which is the Illinois Department of Transportation, acronyms being very helpful for this project, alongside different manufacturers. I collected this material and have been installing them in different locations and sites, whether it be a museum or a gallery space.
Now explain the title. It's After Willis. talk through the rest of it and explain what it means.
So after Willis is a reference to the superintendent of the Chicago Public Schools in Chicago during the 60s when he refused to desegregate the schools there. So it's this sense of thinking about transportation as a way in which a city has been sort of utilized, segregated, how people move through a space. And so the reference back to that is calling attention to how city infrastructure really sort of calls attention to what resources are restricted or gained access to different people throughout a city. And then rubbed, moved, and used, is really sort of calling back attention to the materiality of the surface of that, of what the seat is, what it does, how it sort of situates the body, how it's been used over time.
And how do you get, I can imagine maybe you sitting on a train, going from point A to point B, and just sitting and looking at your people across the aisle and thinking, look at that poor person there and that affluent person there. And it's like, are you thinking that, or was that the inspiration, kind of?
Not necessarily. For me, it's really about thinking about the sort of infrastructure of a space. Like, how does it sort of hold people both physically and also through a conceptual framework? And it does that in a lot of different ways. And yes, the city itself holds people of different backgrounds, ethnicities, class structures, and all of that. It does that without having to really pinpoint in a way that is so direct as naming the body. We see that just through the infrastructure itself.
Michelle, this exhibition takes place in several cities. It requires the cooperation of many institutions.
Indeed.
Did you have any issues with that, in getting cooperation from all the institutions?
No issues.
Not at all?
No, Fred had conversations with a lot of institutional representatives ahead of time, and really kind of sketching out what can happen, what the scope can be. And when I was brought on board, there was a lot of enthusiasm right off the bat.
Now, let's add to that. It involves all these different arts institutions. I imagine, and you two could probably reflect on this, in New York, would MoMA and Guggenheim work together?
Probably not.
So what's different about, and you can all, this is going to be a free-for-all here. I mean, why is it that there's just something about the Midwest that it's more open to collaboration?
Yeah, I think the Midwest, particularly smaller cities, but you can see this in Chicago as well, here in Cleveland, there's a sense that things are a bit more accessible. And I think one of the great things about this triennial is that you'll see art at museums, to smaller nonprofits, to college size or mid-sized galleries, which is great, which at the end of the day brings a more eclectic, diverse group of people. It flattens sort of the perspective of where you can see work, and I think that's a great thing.
What about for you, Phil?
Well, I think it's always been easier to experiment in a city that is more affordable, I mean, at least from existentially, right? Like, you don't, I know a lot of people in New York that don't take a lot of chances because of the economics of taking chances, right? And if you, because there's a lot at stake, in terms of your lifestyle and everything when you do a show. Whereas here, I think, Michelle and I have done a lot of projects together in the Midwest, and they've always been extremely fun, and in a way that I think we were kind of free in a way that we might not have been in a city like New York.
Yeah, can I add to that a little bit?
Yeah, please.
I think something that Front is doing, and Cleveland, or like-sized cities, what we can see here is identify a structure to cities that you can't see in New York. And some of that, and I'm using New York right now. I mean, if you're living in Manhattan,
New York.
Well, not necessarily. I think I'm speaking to a reality. Mm-hmm. And I think when you're in Manhattan, you do not see the structure necessarily of the city. You may see diverse people, but you don't see its civic structures and how it's kind of interwoven, right? And I think in this city, and again, bringing in the public library where Yinka Shonibara's work is, the Federal Reserve, the Mather, art institutions, right. And so you actually see how it's knitted together, and as a result, you understand your role within it. And I think often when you're in large central cities, cultural central cities, it's hard to, what you see first is commerce. right? You see this exchange, right? That comes to the fore. And I think it's not that commerce isn't happening here, but I think you see your relationship to all of its pieces, its relationship to culture, politics, economics, and you see it from street to street, block to block, from east side to west side.
Is it because those cities are bigger and they're more complex in terms of their bureaucracies?
Yes, I think that is one reason. Yes, I think structurally they're just bigger. But I also think how we think about power and how power aggregates in those cities and how it manifests, that's the thing we see first. And that's the thing we're supposed to see first. And I think in a city like Cleveland, that is, we get something else is pulled back. And I think that's very important.
Let's reflect a bit on the point we started out on, the idea that the Midwest, the Great Lakes region, is just as legitimate a place to have a triennial as New York, Paris, or Berlin. I mean, Jessica, Chicago is certainly not an artistic backwater, but it's not a coast. It's not New York or L.A. It's not the home of MoMA or Guggenheim. It's not the home of the Yankees or the Lakers. Is there some satisfaction in is there some satisfaction in representing the Midwest for you?
I mean, definitely. I think that there's definitely value. There's definitely a place, and it's crucial to be able to be a part of all of these different centers and to make sure that there's a voice being heard in those places. And I think that given the fact that the way in which art is made outside of the coast is different or can be different, I think that it's important that work and those artists are shown. So yeah, I do think it's important, and I do think a triennial allows for a very specific moment where people can recognize that and register not only the culture that's happening here, but also what the Midwest can offer to other places.
One of the things you did, Michelle, was travel around the Great Lakes cities and looking for your artists. What did that yield for you?
What it yield is kind of looking at art production in my backyard. Right, I live in Milwaukee. Milwaukee is a Great Lakes city, and spending time also with Lisa Kersner, visiting studios. A lot of studios here in Cleveland, but also Toronto, Buffalo, Sheboygan, Wisconsin, Chicago, Detroit. Really kind of moving around. What did it yield? There was something confirming. I was speaking to somebody the other day, speaking about the fact that there is no style. One cannot identify an aesthetic cohesion from artists practicing in the region. But there may be a bit of truth to the stereotype of hard work and dedication. It's a relationship to time and work. And that was pretty prevalent and rewarding.
That's almost exactly what Oscar Wilde said in one of his interviews. He said he was in Chicago, and he said, "What I like about Chicago is they're strong and young," or something like that. It's like reflecting that same sort of thing. Yes. And it's not. And he was pointing to the East Coast like it's older, more set in its ways, more used to itself and its own glory and that sort of thing. Whereas the young kids towards out further west, didn't have that in their heads, at least not yet. Now, you guys, it's a lot cheaper to be an artist here, just saying. Right? I mean, and Phil, you have that experience. I mean, you're having that experience now in Manhattan, in New York, right?
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, I think one of the reasons that I started making animation was not purely out of the necessity of it, but it's cheaper to make animation than to have a giant studio and make paintings in New York. And, New York is a sort of pressure cooker in a way. And, it kind of really boils you down to who you are. And I think I really wanted to be free in the studio, and that was really important. And so to liberate myself from some of those, the economics was really important, so that there wasn't, this kind of underlying this hamster wheel that I was sort of running on if I were sort of making show after show of paintings in New York or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. No, that's not the only reason, but certainly that freedom makes a big difference, I think.
Michelle, in dealing with the current issues in American cities, you've also, Front has come up against some controversy. Like most recently, the Asian dope boys with the visa issues they had. That's been resolved.
That's been resolved.
but it's par for the course when you're dealing with I imagine a thematic exhibition that's dealing with contemporary social issues.
Yeah, I'm not sure how the Bees is related directly to the thematic of the American city. I mean, it does tell us that our rights to free speech are something that have to be fought for on a daily basis. We can't take them for granted, and that includes also within culture as well.
We'll talk about, in the same regard, talk about the Cleveland Public Library installation, which has to deal with a very hot topic right now, immigration.
Oh, yeah. We were talking over the weekend a little bit about Yinka Shonibera's piece, and as you've been hearing me say throughout this talk, that I really cherish the participation of the civic institutions in the arc of front. And that was, thinking about bringing Yinka Shonibera into the public library made a lot of sense after knowing his British library. But as we as a nation right now are thinking about borders and immigration, that project became very profound.
During the 3 months of front, within it, some other Northeast Ohio artists are making use of the international spotlight. The Collective Arts Network, or CAN Triennial, will be on display during this month. And yet another group has organized what they are calling the Can't Triennial, billing itself as You Can't Be Rejected from Can't. What is your relationship? What is Front's relationship with these other groups? We see our friend Michael Gills here representing CAN. Is this like a friendly competition, or how are you feeling about it?
Well, I think it is a competition to artists, to arts organizers, and it should be. I stand by the fact that this is a reflection of a very healthy cultural community when we have pushback, critique, alternatives, all kinds of other offerings. I just think it represents the richness of this city.
Any particular? I can't push you to talk about your children, but are there as we talk about things as you've been going? You started out by saying, I had one set of expectations going into this.
Yes.
And they have modified over time.
Yes.
Have there been delights along that way?
Yes, absolutely. And as things change and shift, we have to understand the source of that shifting, right? Sometimes it comes from a relationship with an artist, talking to an artist over a period of time, and to see how they're evolving their work. And, I'm very grateful to have that opportunity to be able to work with different artists and to talk to them about the ideas that are, again, modifying, thinking about. Fundamentally, I take on the role of a curator because I can then offer artists an opportunity to not only stretch their work by offering them new contexts or give them different resources, bring them to a city and have different relationships with people. That is fundamentally why I do this. It's not about me as a curator. It's not about me as authorship. It's not about, the thematic even of American City. It really is at this point about the artists. So when you're talking about the change, the shift over time, it comes from these conversations, but it also comes from the world that we're living in. Different ideas, different events in the world will come and inform differently the priorities that we're all living with. So there's an ethical relationship to how that gets played out in exhibitions like this. And artists are always dealing with that ethical relationship of subject. And now, again, we're at that point where I'm happy to be sitting here and hand off front to all of you. The artists are here, but now it is up to everybody who will view front to start bringing ideas and interpret the work and have different navigations through the work. Analyze these ideas, challenge me, challenge the thematic, even challenge the artists. Deep looking is required at this point.
You describe yourself as a sort of a hands-off in terms of not imposing, your will or your ideas on something, but kind of nurturing it along. Whereas some some exhibitions have a very named curator who it is a reflection of them. It is, and the artists are just their pieces, their pawns to make their thing happen. And so that exists, right? And the artists can attest to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, actually, having done things with Michelle in the past, I remember this goes back to like maybe 10 years ago or something like that, but I can remember Michelle saying a long time ago, she's like, I want to give the artist the freedom to fail at something and to kind of make the space available so that the space isn't just this sort of venue for absolute success and triumph or something like that, but that it's actually a site for experimentation and possibility, and that, and that was made available to me a couple of times, and I was always thankful that Michelle and I would have a conversation about something, and we would both kind of think like, well, I wonder how that's going to turn out, and it wasn't this, and that was more like the adventure of doing the project versus the sort of like kind of professionalism of doing the project, and that always made me want to do more. Because that's the way that I like to work.
That is Phil Vanderheiden. He's the artist behind Volatility Smile, an installation at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. Next to him is Jessica Vaughn. She's the artist behind the After Willis Rubbed, Used, and Moved installation at the Akron Art Museum. And right here is Michelle Grabner, artistic director of the Front Triennial. So we've been jabbering away here for a while, and we're going to begin right now the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone out there, City Club members, guests, students, or those who are joining us via our live stream. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. Holding the microphones today, our Youth Forum Council Chair, Tiolu Orsanya. Did I get that right? You got it? And the other one, Bliss Davis. I can handle that. So raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and then one of the folks will come to you.
You touched upon it, but could you talk a little bit more about the role international artists are going to have in this?
Well, that's wide. The role international artists are having in this, in the exhibition, is wide-reaching. There's a lot of artists who are here from different countries. Right now, many of us are staying at the Madison in Glenville, and it's we gather outside, and I can't tell you how many languages are being spoken at any given time. So the international art community is well represented within Front.
Is there a brochure or a list, or where do you find these events?
Right. Well, start with the website. The website can be changed and updated on a daily basis, so that's where you'll get all the updates. But there's also a flyer that you can pick up anywhere. I was just at the art store, and I saw a stack there. I was at the coffee shop recently, so there's lots of them, and I bet you there's some around here, probably on the way out. Maybe Arlene brought a couple things for us. Michelle.
I would like to remind everybody that we are now known as the North Coast or the Third Coast. And I had a question also.
Branding.
How many people do you think you're expecting who aren't artists? Who's coming? And how does that compare to the kind of people that we get from the Rock Hall when we have the induction here? Do you know?
Yeah, my thought about an audience that will be that I like to consider an accidental audience, right? Just by the fact that you're driving downtown, you're going to see a Julian Stancic mural that's towering. If you go to the Rock Hall, if you're from the region and you walk into the Rock Hall, you're also going to see a project by John Hershend, an artist from San Francisco. So there's going to be many accidental visitors, as well as those who are coming from out of town and those who are local who plan to engage in Front for the course of the exhibition.
There's a question.
Speaking about visitors, just curious what the idea was behind having it in 3 different sort of cities here. And, David mentioned what a collaboration between MoMA and Guggenheim might be in New York, but it wouldn't happen. It would be in, there's the Whitney Triennial, for example. And just wondering why, in terms of that, it's just at one institution. I'm just curious as to what the idea was behind having it at Oberlin, Akron Museum of Art. I mean, they're not super close together also. And
and I can say that, being brought in, if Fred didn't have that laid out, already sketched out, that he wanted to work with Oberlin and Akron, that I don't know if I would have understood the region well enough to think about reaching that far to bring these other cities in. Because we're working with them, they're very different kinds of cities, and I think that also helps with understanding and analyzing the thematic of an American city. So it's not just Cleveland, for instance, it's Akron and it's Oberlin. Not only are they different size cities, they have different value structures. And I think that's really important as well.
Are you going to be doing any measurement of the economic impact that all the international visitors and national visitors are coming to Cleveland? And if so, what are you measuring?
Yes, we are. And I could defer to these people sitting at the table here who have been spending a long time working on that. But also I know it's going to be measured by, for instance, MoCA. They're going to kind of come and understand what it means, the individual institutions as well. So I'm not going to be able to give you the answer, but afterwards you can talk to Arlene and Fred.
Yes, that's a question for Michelle. We heard there's a lot of triennial, biennial, people sort of have some kind of fatigue. But in Northeast Ohio, it's very new. So actually the people here are very excited. So compared to the peers like a Documenta in Castle, it's really reflecting the art's role in the political scene, and comparing to others like Whitney, New Orleans. How you describe the authenticity of France compared to the other triennial, biennial I just mentioned?
Yeah, no, Michelle, I think it does have to do with where it's located in the American interior, right? It's interesting. It does have a relationship with Prospect New Orleans, a closer relationship, I think, than all of the other biennials and triennials that, we actually know. And it's interesting because one of the very first conversations I had with Fred when Fred brought me in was that, when we think about Prospect, it was important that culture, established itself in a city that was, recently under siege by a natural disaster, and how culture can come in and create a focus. And Cleveland is not that. Fred said to me, Cleveland is thriving in most cases and in most aspects, and that we should celebrate that, and that it's very rich culturally, and we should put that forward. So that is, I do have to say that, and we all know, those of us who are in this city, is that, it's not categorically the ideal model of the utopic city on a hill yet, right? But I think as I've been spending time here, there is great intention for it to move forward, to understand where it fails, understand its successes. And I hope that this project will put that forward. Yes, I think that is not exactly the answer. Well, that is not exactly the answer to your question, Michelle, but it is I sketched around it a little bit.
One of the things that's going on and was just referred to a couple minutes ago was the restoration of the Julian Stanchik mural. That is a remnant of a program that was in the early 70s when Cleveland was down on its luck, and the city fathers determined that maybe with a few $1,000s worth of paint we could put murals up on the sides of buildings and enlighten the place, make the place a little brighter. To my knowledge, only one of them, at least there's one prominent one on 9th Street, the Happiness is Sitting on a Park Bench. I think that's the only one that remains, the one that I can remember. But the Stanchik one is interesting because Julian Stanchik, internationally known op artist, and part of the op art movement in the 1960s, and he made one of his creations, and it was up on the wall for many, many years, and then one day it was painted over by when the building transfer happened. So it brings to mind the kind of issue of public art and its ephemerality, maybe. Does a mural painted on the side of a building, is that meant to stay forever? And so what you guys are doing is bringing that magnificent work back, and you can see it now. It's getting very close to being finished. And it's inspirational to see that.
Yes. No, and I think you bring up another point, David, that's very important, and that is talking about the visual language of that piece. It's an abstraction, right? It deals with opticality. It deals with composition, order, the energies of how those colors come together. And to understand that abstraction was really part of a lexicon, a public lexicon, where the public would understand it as, be able to translate abstraction into understanding a relationship to order, to the politics of the day, and to figure out where we are now. I mean, we understand that a lot of our murals, we see them, and they're very representational. They're stories, they're narratives. So to see abstraction, and I'm sitting here on stage with two artists who also think about abstraction, and that doesn't mean they're not bringing other issues along with it, but to be able to challenge the viewer to not have to just consume, to read, to see something that's representational, but actually challenge the viewer with the language as well. That's really important. And again, both Jessica and Phil take on that language and stretch it.
And Jessica, when you lay out your seat covers on the wall, you say you're reflecting what the bus or the train looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's the starting point. And then from there, it's really considering the space itself of where it's being installed. Like, for example, at the Akron Museum, there's a lot of sort of picking and choosing with the collection of the inserts that I have. How does this sit in relationship to the Akron Museum, not as just a site, but also specific to the other works around it? So to your point, Michelle, really thinking about not only the language of abstraction, and which is important, and minimalism as well. There's also, what does this seat hold? What is this a container for? How are we thinking about the body in a different way? Where the infrastructure itself is a way of saying, hey, the body in some respect is already marked before I even sit on that train, before the neighbor next to me does. And so I think trying to figure out those cues and reread the infrastructure, the civic institutions around us in a different way, I think positions ourselves as citizens in a more direct way, one where we can really think about what we're contributing to society.
And Phil, as you were saying, you're dealing in an abstract way with the jittery nature of our relationship with finances and economy and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, actually, my background is in abstract painting, and I still kind of think about it in that way. And the software that I use, like I was saying before, it is completely ethereal. A lot of the animations, I'm literally programming in math equations directly into something, and it's generating a three-dimensional form. And so and also just as a kind of meditation on abstraction, I mean, money is a incredibly big abstraction that sort of pervades our lives, and I actually I think a lot about that, but that it's like our abstractions as paintings, where they are these things that sort of exist in this kind of other reality, and then they are kind of brought to the world, and they are kind of made concrete and become part of the actual room that one is standing in. And that relationship, whether I was making actual oil on canvas paintings or whether I'm making the animations that I'm making now, that was always sort of the interesting part, was sort of like, how does this thing land, and how does the rubber meet the road, as it were, in terms of abstraction. And so I think the Stanzik thing is so incredible, because just the idea of that existing and someone actually kind of temporarily going blind as they drive down the street staring at this thing kind of gives me a good feeling. I don't know.
And it's the joy of public art that you're not putting a statue of a general out there. It's something that you look at it and you go, wow, so it does engage you more, probably. Other questions?
Hi. When placing an artist with their work in a location, how did you consider who was being placed where? Was there a conversation between the artist and the institution? How did that happen?
Yeah, it's a range. I'm going to use the example of Dawood Bey, who has an amazing installation at St. John's Church. And, I think initially he was talking to Fred about having an exhibition at Transformer Station. He sees his work as, photographs to be framed on a wall in a clean white space. And it was a slow conversation to bring him over, to walk him down the street, to consider this space. So when I brought him into St. John's Church, immediately he wanted to put the paintings on the wall to the sides of the church instead of suspending him is what he ended up doing. But it took a while, right? It takes a while for artists to warm up to things and to engage in space. And I think, just talking to him, going forward, this is a way of thinking about how his photography can work in space that Jessica's talking about, that powerful political space of bodies, and how photography can work in there. That's just amazing to me. So I use that as an example to say, I think with every artist, with every piece of work, it was a different conversation.
Michael, you have a question?
I am, here, you do that, responsible for the aforementioned regionally focused Cannes Triennial, and not involved in the curation. I sort of watched that happen, but I look at this exhibit as sort of a voice of the artists of the region, and there are 90 of them in it. And so looking across the work that was ultimately chosen and delivered, I was fascinated to see themes emerge. Maybe no surprise that water was a very significant one here on the lake and the river. There are